Good evening. Good evening and welcome to this large, wonderful audience. And welcome to those of you who are joining us live stream on the Frick's Fora TV channel. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator at the collection, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. J. Clarke, Manton Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Sterling and Francine Clarke Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Colin Bailey, the Frick's Deputy Director and Chief Curator, and I had the great pleasure of working with Dr. Clarke in selecting the works for our current exhibition, the Impressionist line From Degas to Toulouse-Lautrec, Drawings and Prints from the Clarke. The exhibition, which opened yesterday and will remain on view until June 16th, presents 58 French 19th century master prints and drawings from the Clarke's holdings. This exceptional opportunity to show works that are not normally on view, even at the Clarke, came about because of the extensive renovation and the museum is undergoing at this time. Many of the collection's highlights are being displayed in museums around the globe. The Frick was fortunate to be able to borrow this group of drawings and prints, as well as Piero della Francesca's The Virgin and Child Enthroned with Four Angels, which is the centerpiece of our Piero exhibition in the Oval Room. Dr. Clarke holds a PhD from Brown University. She joined the staff of the Clarke in 2009 as curator of prints, drawings, and photographs. Over the last 4 years, she's organized exhibitions on the prints of Albrecht Dürer and the photographs of Thomas Struth, just to mention a few. For the Impressionist line exhibition, she was not only co-curator, but editor of the accompanying catalog, in which she wrote the stellar introductory essay. Last year, Dr. Clarke edited and contributed to the catalog of the Manton collection of British art, a recent gift to the Clarke. She also lectures regularly in the Williams College graduate program in the history of art. Before coming to Williamstown, Dr. Clarke had a long tenure at the Art Institute of Chicago. One of the many exhibitions she organized in Chicago is her 2009 exhibition, Becoming Edvard Munch, Influence, Anxiety, and Myth, which received the American Association of Art Museum Curators Award for the best exhibition of that year. She's published and lectured widely on the art of Munch, Max Beckmann, as well as Kathy Kolowitz and Max Lieberman and Max Klinger. This evening, Dr. Clarke will offer another view of Impressionism, which we largely associate with paintings, through the artist's highly experimental and spontaneous works on paper. After the lecture, the exhibitions will remain open for viewing until 7:30, so we hope you'll join us downstairs. For now, please join me in welcoming J. Clarke to the podium.
Thank you, Susan, for that lovely introduction. I'm so delighted to be here. It's really an honor to be speaking at the Frick on the occasion of this collaborative project. And as I said a couple of nights ago, we had so much fun putting this exhibition together, we really shouldn't have been paid for it, but don't tell my boss that. So I thought I'd tell you just a bit about the Clarke for those of you who may not have been there. It's a wonderful museum and research center in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and it's in a very exciting place. It's a museum with a dual mission, which has both collections and a research institute. Also at the Clarke is housed the Williams Graduate Program in Art History. So it's a really exciting place of ideas. There's always lectures going on, fellows from all over the world, exhibitions, lectures. It's a vibrant community. Right now, we're undergoing a major campus expansion. The Clarke sits on 140 acres, and we have a new Tadao Ando building that's being erected as we speak. It's coming out of the ground. It's very exciting. And Annabelle Seldorf, the great architect here from Manhattan, is renovating our two extant buildings. So in July of 2014, come on up to the country in the Berkshires and see the brand new Clarke. It's very, very vibrant, exciting place. So again, my thanks to Susan Grace Galassi and Colin Bailey, my partners in crime on this exhibition, and many other Frick staff who are here this evening, who made this exhibition really so beautiful on the walls. It's really such a treat to see. And as Susan said, I hope you all go take a look at it after the lecture and come back again and again. There's a lot of exciting works up there. So when we think of Impressionism, we tend to think of works like these. On the left, we have Claude Monet's Woman in the Garden of 1866, which just happens to be up the street right now at the Impressionism in Fashion exhibition. And on the right, Monet's Water Lily Pond, Pink Harmony of 1900. So these works are, about 35 years apart. On the left, we see these gorgeously clad women enjoying themselves outside in the garden. It was painted from life and finished in the studio, and it's all about fleeting light, shadow, color, brushstrokes. And Impressionists like Monet captured these passing views and this idea of capturing modern life as it moved in front of them. They're very interested in the urban scene. And in all its colorful glory on the left, they also focused on the landscape. And again, we see Monet's Japanese footbridge at his wonderful property in Giverny. And the lily pond is one of a series of 12 views of his property that Monet created during that summer of 1899 and then into 1900. So as we know, he was often working in series and capturing different light effects at different times of day and different seasons. And our modern day understanding of Impressionism is really about optical sensation, capturing the changing seasons, as we said Monet's doing on the left, and the times of day. And another common trope or sort of characteristic of Impressionism are the lush layers of oil paint, broad, unmodulated daubs of paint like we see on the right. And Impressionism, as we have come to believe, is about modern life, about oil paintings on canvas, and about visual sensations and exterior reality. But what about drawing and printmaking? How did the Impressionist line manifest itself in the consciousness of its time? How did the linearity we see in this magical Jean-François Daumier on the left, this red chalk drawing, how did works like this impact Impressionism and influence it? This is a story that is far less well known than it should be. Works of art on paper are more democratic than paintings or sculpture. They were able to negotiate more porous boundaries, economic, class, political, creative, as well as in the art press. And although it's been treated as such to a large extent in the past, the Impressionist line was no second-class citizen to painting, says the curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs. It was, in fact, far more mobile, visible, and one could argue had the opportunity to be even more modern. So as a way to navigate the vast terrain of the last half of the 19th century, we're going to consider very briefly 3 different types of works on paper: caricature, realism and its intersection with the burgeoning field of photography and the popular press, and Impressionism, experimental, economic, and institutional engagement with prints and drawings. So here I show you 3 very different kinds of works. Again, the red chalk drawing by Daumier on the left, a watercolor by Constantin Guis, and an etching by Édouard Manet. And all of these works date from the 1860s, exactly the same time period. 2 very different art critics, Charles Baudelaire and Charles Blanc, penned texts in the 1860s that considered the interconnections between printmaking, drawing, and the modern condition. Baudelaire's essay, Painters and Etchers, celebrated etching because it was, quote, so admirably expressive of the personal character of the artist. He went on to describe specific etchings as, quote, sketches, praising their sureness of drawing. The status of the painter-printmaker, very much embodied in Manet's Boy with a Dog right here, who made original works, was elevated when Baudelaire emphasized the etching's expressive potential, its relationship to drawing, and the revelation of an artistic personality. A more famous text that was penned by Baudelaire in 1863 was his Painter of Modern Life, in which he chronicled the flaneur, the gentleman who paraded around the streets of Paris. And by modernity, he meant the transitory, the fugitive, and the contingent. Although many assumed that Baudelaire was talking about the famous painter, Édouard Manet, in fact, the painter of modern life he described in his pages was the lesser-known draftsman Constantin Guisse. And here we see the sort of prototypical flaneur walking around the streets of Paris, chatting with women, probably based by their costumes of questionable reputation. But it's one of the things that Guisse often did is he showed the flaneur walking in the streets and chatting with women, and that was really sort of a part of his vocabulary, this gentleman, top-hatted man. The other critic we were talking about, Charles Blanc, began his career as editor of the very august art journal, the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, in which his thoughts on drawings were initially published. He considered all art forms, painting, architecture, and sculpture, were part of the creative intellect, and they all connected themselves to drawing. So again, painting, architecture, and sculpture, he saw all as forms of drawing. Drawing is where everything began in the artist's intellect and in their creative force. And for Blanc, etching was also a drawn art. He described them, quote, not a translation of impressions, they are original works. The artist writes upon the copper plate his thoughts and his memories. And he took great pains to foreground the originality of these arguably reproducible images. The rhetoric of drawing's freedom and spontaneity, discussed in his groundbreaking book, became a touchstone for critics, artists, and educators throughout the rest of the century. So today we're going to explore the lives of these prints and drawings, to see how the Impressionist line developed from the private artist sketch that never left the studio to the full and vital component of the Impressionist movement foregrounded in their very public exhibitions. We will consider how these works of art were created, for what purpose, and how they were displayed, circulated, and sold. Today, caricature is considered an art of exaggeration, a politicized genre that appears in newspapers to mock or satirize, and we can all think of many New Yorker cartoons that we laugh at weekly. The same was true in the 1850s and the 1860s, but thanks again to the writing of Charles Baudelaire, it was increasingly associated with modernity. Baudelaire felt that caricature was closer to the pulse of life than most art forms. He saw it as a mirror of life. Honoré Daumier, who we see on the left and the right, was one of the greats of 19th century French caricature. His pointed political critiques got him actually in a lot of trouble. And here we see on the left a caricature of the then reigning constitutional monarch Louis Philippe, and he often described him as a pear. So here we see this pear-like face, and it's called, this particular lithograph is called Past, Present, and Future. And Daumier created literally thousands of these drawings that were then translated into lithographs. He drew them on the lithographic stone, and they were circulated very widely in journals. But due to very strict government censorship, Louis Philippe did not particularly like being poked fun at. So he was in jail for several months because of his very pointed political critiques. So one of the things that he did later in his career is he turned to making watercolors, more finished watercolors for a very specific market. And what we have here on the left is the judges, these three judges who are in the Palais de Justice, in all their robes, looking very impressed with themselves. Their noses slightly in the air, talking about all the wonderful things they've done all day. And Daumier, because he was brought to court so many times, he had a particular affinity for poking fun at the judges who ended up putting him in prison. So when one thinks of Claude Monet, the chromatic dazzler of French Impressionist painting who we saw at the beginning, we rarely think of caricature. But Monet began his career making caricatures. And on the left, we see Claude Monet, very early work by him. And at that time, he went by Oscar. That's why it says, Oh, Monet. He was Oscar Claude Monet. And then later in his life, like Cher, Madonna, and all the rest, he decided to change his name. But these were called portraits chargés, so the idea of a charged portrait, a portrait of a person that gave it a sort of electrical charge, a sort of critical edge to it, and who was very influenced by Daumier. We see another Daumier on the right. This was a likeness of the politician and historian Alexis de Tocqueville, who's depicted with this very large head atop this tiny body. So as a teenager, growing up in this port town of Le Havre, Monet earned money and significant attention for the very first time, making just such caricatures and drawings for newspapers and magazines. And works like this on the left, which are quite large scale, you'll see one downstairs, were probably created for a specific clientele. We don't know who this gentleman is, but he is known as caricature of a man with a snuff box. So snuff is a kind of smokeless tobacco that you snort in your nose and gives you some sort of, I don't know what, some sort of jolt. But the interesting thing is what we see here is the handkerchief and then the large nose. So we have the idea that in goes the snuff, hand goes to the handkerchief, achoo! So the sneeze almost always followed the inhalation of the snuff. So it's a very charming and very funny image, but we can see the really bold handling. We can see Monet knew how to draw. And to give you an example of how far he went in just 3 years, this is a beautiful drawing, a chalk drawing downstairs called the Port et Toc. So just a few years later, after he began training in Paris, his more official art training, he started creating just beautiful works of art like this. You can just imagine the clouds scudding across the sky, just barely explained, but you can see exactly what he's trying to show us. So drawing from the nude form, male or female, had long been considered the very apex of the academic training at the French Academy. The focus on the nude body, rather than on landscape or portraiture, which was seen as a much lower genre, was the product of an arcane but slowly shifting belief that the end goal of academic training was to create oil paintings that reflected moral tales, subjects from history, subjects from the Bible. And what we have here is a drawing by Bouguereau, who was no doubt a very academically trained artist, a fantastic draftsman. And this would have been used for a painting that he later created on Apollo and the Muses. And he would not have considered his drawing on the left an independent work to be sold, ever. This would have been a kind of tool that he kept in his studio and used it when he was making other paintings. So the ways that drawing and printmaking really intersected in the 1860s and 1870s was complicated by the artistic and political debates around verisimilitude. The idea of graphic spontaneity, which we of course see with the Impressionists, and the rise of photography. There was a great deal of productive confusion. And the popularity and the popularization of photography encouraged and discouraged certain kinds of artistic experimentation during this time period. It was a very exciting period where all the rules were changing. No one knew what was good, what was bad, what was up, what was down. And idealism, which we have on the left, and realism, which we have on the right, were often perceived as one and the same thing. Now, what we have on the right is a beautiful charcoal and chalk drawing by François Bonvin, who was one of the leading figures of the French realist movement, which was a very politically charged movement where they really wanted to show people as they were, show the poor people. And Bonvin was born from a very poor family in Paris and became an artist only after one of his neighbors saw his talent as a draftsman and offered to pay for his education. And these kinds of highly finished drawings that we see on the right, this Bonvin, you see it's signed and dated here. This was actually signed later, but it's signed and dated here. It was a very finished drawing. Bouguereau exhibited these drawings at the Salon and sold them as finished works, which may not seem like such a big deal to us, but this was very new in the 1860s. So 2 years after Bonvin created the drawing we just looked at, he supported his young friend Manet. Manet's works were being rejected by the Salon, and so Bonvin opened up his studio and created an exhibition for his friends, Manet among them, Fantin-Latour, and other realists. And whereas Bonvin's drawing style, with its dense lines and careful delineation, remained mostly the same for the remainder of his life, Manet's approach to the painted and the drawn line was moving in a very different direction. one that was much more improvisational and sketchy. And here we see a beautiful etching called The Toilette from 1862. And the realist impulse to capture supposedly exterior, objective reality didn't necessarily mean an embrace of photography. A lot of the realists were dead set against photography. And both artists and art critics alike tended to work within this seemingly diametric opposition between the energetic lines of the so-called painter-printmaker, Manet, a painter who also made prints, and the supposed truth of the photographic image, likewise printed by matrices onto paper. So whereas Bonvin could be described as photographic, Manet was sketchy, but they were both realists. So again, this very, very exciting time. So this false oppositional rhetoric that we're talking about is evident in the reaction to Manet's very first print portfolio, which we see here. This was one of the prints in the portfolio, which was published by Kadar, a print publisher, in 1862. So the same year, Kadar had launched what was called the Society of Etchers, a commercial and artistic venture that aimed to encourage the production of etchings created by painters, thereby saving the medium from the downtrodden hands of the professional printmaker who did it for money, heaven forbid. So this venture endorsed a process that was very akin to drawing. So again, we see it looks very much like a drawing, and it is, in a way, a drawing. It's an etching, which is drawn with a very sharp needle onto a copper plate and then printed. The art critic Théophile Gautier wrote in his preface to the first annual publication of the Society of Etchers portfolio, quote, "In these times in which photography charms the vulgar by the mechanical fidelity of its reproductions, it was inevitable that a tendency to free caprice and picturesque fantasy would declare itself in art. The need to react against positivism of the instrument mirror led more than one painter to take up the etching needle. Nothing is more simple, more personal, and more direct than the etching. Every etching is an original drawing. How many charming motifs, how many exquisite inventions, how many impulsive movements has this rapid and easy method of etching conserved?" So in a way, he's taking this sort of photographic exactitude that was evident, obviously, in the photographic matrix and saying, this is more real, what these artists are doing, because it comes from improvisation, it comes from the mind, it comes from the intellect. And here I just wanted to give you a sense of how some of these works of art, these etchings and drawings, were marketed. This is the Société des Aqua Fortis, as we can see here. This is the headquarters of Kadar. He was the printer. And so here we see these women in their crinolines, and then right in the windows, we see everyone walking up and looking at the etchings that are there on display. So they were sold in a very private way, and they were looked through sort of like books in your home, but they were also shown in this very public fashion. So this is a wonderful pastel, which is Jean-François Millet, and it goes without saying that most everything I'm showing you, you can go downstairs and look at later. So most of these works are in the exhibition. And his representations of peasant at work were infused with these invocations of piety and this reverence for the very cyclical nature of their project. This is the sower, so he's dropping seeds across this vast, vast field. And then here's the person who's plowing. And it's interesting that here his head exactly intersects the horizon. And the sun comes bursting through the clouds, almost like he's a holy figure, almost as it's some sort of proto-religious image. And of course, sowing is something that is very much a biblical kind of characteristic in many ways. So he's showing this very heroic labor carried out, and he had a lot of social connections, Millet, and the realists were very interested in supporting and promoting the causes of the worker. So this figure, again, is often associated with a biblical text, and the sower prepares the earth for the seeds of God, the sowing and the reaping. And in addition to, and somehow maybe even in contrast to, the complex tenor of this religious and political image is the fact that the sower reflects this growing and even marketed trend for Millet's works on paper, both prints and pastels. And he made many of these pastels for specific patrons. So in this time, there was an emerging popularity for the pastels, as we're going to see by Degas, Pissarro, Manet, and Millet was very much drawn to this medium for technical reasons and commercial. And the economic impetus came from one collector in particular, Émile Gauguin, who attempted to corner the market and buy up all Millet's pastels. He didn't want Millet to sell them to anyone else, although fortunately a couple got away, and this was one of them. And over just a 5-year period, Gauguin acquired about 100 pastels by Millet. This is a drawing by L'Hermite. This is called The Wine Press from 1872. And this kind of charcoal drawing, like the Bon Vin we saw earlier that was very carefully signed, this was created specifically for the market. There was a very well-known dealer in Paris whose name was Durand-Ruel, and he exhibited these for the first time in London in the 1870 and 71. You have to understand, Paris was in the middle of the Franco-Prussian War, so there wasn't much of an art market in Paris. So he showed these at a gallery in London, and they were snapped up so quickly that he actually commissioned L'Hermite to make more. And he started showing drawings in his gallery, which before then was really much more associated with paintings. So again, this market for these wonderful charcoal drawings is getting stronger and stronger. And just as a side note here, L'Hermite, who again is not as well known, just as you can see, just an amazing draftsman. He really captures them after their labors, working hard, taking a rest, sampling the wine that they're making. And one artist who's very influenced by him was Vincent van Gogh. And he called him the Millet of black and white. So Millet in color, and L'Hermite was the Millet of black and white. So he was very interested in L'Hermite's work. L'Hermite's work was often reproduced in the popular press, so Van Gogh would have had a chance to see it. And you can imagine the very early kind of potato eater period of Van Gogh. You can definitely see the influence of L'Hermite. So now we get to Impressionism on paper, the real thing, Impressionism. Before this, we have realism, we have caricature, and by Impressionism, I mean the exhibitions that were organized by a group of artists who were later dubbed the Impressionists by art critics. So among the most common complaint that was lodged against the Impressionists by their detractors was a lack of drawing. That is to say, the definable, exact rendering of space and form. By contrast, on the occasion of the second exhibition, the art critic of the Impressionists, the art critic Paul Duranty wrote a lengthy study on Impressionism in which he said he aimed to put the movement in a kind of context, and he emphasized the role of drawing, perhaps a surprise to today's readers who consider Impressionism more a movement focused on painting. He said, quote, "The pencil will be soaked in the very sap of life. We will not simply see moderate lines made by compass, but expressive, animated forms, logically deduced. But the drawing is such an individual means," he went on to say, "and so indispensable, we cannot ask for methods, procedures, or views. It merges completely with the goal and remains the invisible companion of the idea." So very much the same way Baudelaire described prints and drawings a number of years earlier, drawing and the modern condition were seen as inseparably linked, as was the notion that drawn lines were creative and ideational. You think of writing, an artist thinking and writing, a writer thinking and drawing on the page with pen and ink. And in fact, prints and drawings made up nearly 50% of the works on view in the 8 Impressionist exhibitions, which were, of course, organized by the artists themselves. Impressionist prints and drawings, more so than the linear manifestations that we've already seen from the 1850s and the 1860s, were directly connected to public and commercial vehicles, such as the exhibitions and dealers. So despite the Impressionist avant-garde position, we're against the Academy, we're against everything, they still wanted to make money, and they still needed to make money. So this beautiful pastel by Camille Pissarro, which is called the Boulevard de Rochechouart from 1880, was really just a tour de force. It's very unusual in Pissarro's work of this period. Later on in the 90s, he did an entire series of paintings of city views, but this is one of the very first and the very largest pastels he did of this Parisian boulevard. And it's so wonderful. You see this omnibus, and when you go downstairs later, you can actually see people sitting here in the omnibus. So there's carts, there's carriages, there's people walking around, And you can see with this blue tonality, blue, violet, the tan color of the paper very much acts as a color underneath everything, and the gray, the brown, the yellow, it's very much a winter day. There's no leaves on the trees. You have that feeling of winter, and this feeling of activity. Well, of course, the art critics were not too excited by this very sketchy quality of the Impressionists. And one art critic went to say, it looks like there's some drunk man with dye who's tripped all over the streets of Paris and thrown his colors on this pastel. So they didn't appreciate, as we do today, this very open facture that the Impressionists used. And as I mentioned before, the art of pastel, as we saw with the Pissarro, was becoming very popular. And artists like Édouard Degas, this work is not in the exhibition, neither of these works are, but these are both from the Clarke collection. And the one on the left is called The Entrance of the Masked Dancers from 1884. And on the right, Manet's Marie Laurent from 1882. Now, Degas started creating a number of pastels right around this time period and started selling them as paintings. So large scale, very major works. And Manet, this was actually one of a group of works that was shown at the dealer I mentioned before, Durand-Ruel, a group of portraits of fashionable Parisiennes, so very fashionable women whose names were known, who were seen as not necessarily part of the demi-monde, but women that were very much appreciated for the way that they dressed, very much appreciated for their fashion. So Édouard Degas, and his colleagues, including the American Impressionist Mary Cassatt. So here we have Édouard Degas on the left, who's doing a portrait of Mary Cassatt at the Louvre. So this is Mary Cassatt, and this is her sister Lydia. And then this is Mary Cassatt, the artist, who shows a woman at the opera with her fan, sort of brandishing her fan at the opera, which is used very much as a flirtation, hiding device. So what Degas and Mary Cassatt and their contemporaries wanted to do is they joined forces to create a new art journal that was called Night and Day. And they wanted to illustrate this art journal only with prints. And here we see two prints that were made specifically for this journal that were never realized. So not only does Impressionism have a vehicle to show prints in the exhibitions, but they're also creating these prints to be reproduced in the popular press. So the popular press and the print are starting to come closer and closer together. And another example of this is this fantastic drawing by Monet, which you'll see downstairs, which is called View of Rouen from 1882. And this is kind of an interesting work of art that in many ways a kind of crossover between drawings, paintings, prints, and the popular press. So what we have is this beautiful chalk drawing, and it's done on something that's called Gillot paper, G-I-L-L-O-T. And you can see, this is this area right here, magnified. See these vertical striations? This Gillot paper was created specifically so artists could make drawings that would later be reproduced for art journals. So this art journal, which was called Art, not very inventive, but this art journal was writing an article on Monet and very much wanted to feature a painting he did that he showed at the Salon of 1882. But at the time, photography was not really able to reproduce paintings to be in journals. Photography was very muddy when it came to reproducing oil painting. So what the journal did is they asked Monet to do a drawing after his painting, which was then photographed and reproduced, and here we see it photographically reproduced in the journal down here at the lower right. So here these media are kind of becoming interconnected, and artists are making works of art not as works of art in and of themselves, but making drawings just to be reproduced in journals. So again, the journal trade is really burgeoning at this point in time. Art journals are, growing like you can't even imagine. A very different group, very different sensibility. Gauguin early on showed with the Impressionists at the Impressionist exhibition and then went on in his own direction. But these are two prints from his wonderful series called the Volpini Suite. And the Volpini Suite got its name because in 1889, Gauguin and his contemporaries were not admitted to the great Parisian exposition of 1889. They were not welcome, shall we say. So they thumbed their nose at the establishment and they said, well, we're going to open our own exhibition, which they did at the Café Volpini, which was owned by a man whose name was Volpini. Thereafter, this was known as the Volpini suite. And what we have here is, it's a series of etchings, and it was actually Vincent van Gogh's brother, Theo, who said to Gauguin, why do you make some prints that connect to paintings you've already done, and in this way, advertise your work? So these relate to two extant compositions. On the left, we have The Joys of Brittany, and here we see these women in their Breton coiffes. You can see them obviously in the northern part of France. And he was very interested in capturing this, what he saw as a simpler way of life, leaving modern-day Paris and going to Brittany to see how the simple people lived, or so he thought. And then on the right, we see a group of women all sort of cuddled up against the cold wind. This is called the Arlésiennes, the old women of Arles. And as many of us remember, Gauguin had a very ill-fated working relationship with Vincent van Gogh. He went to Arles in the south of France, and Vincent van Gogh very much wanted to have a sort of artistic family and artistic community with Gauguin. And then we know probably from a variety of images what happened. He cut part of his ear off, and that pretty much ended that. But in any case, this beautiful yellow paper is so unusual for this time period. And the idea is that it may have been inspired by the yellow house that Van Gogh and Gauguin lived in together. They were also painting a lot of sunflowers at the time, again, this very potent yellow color. But these kinds of colors are really only used for wrapping paper. You rarely saw this used as for a fine art print. So this yellow is very unusual, and it was later picked up by the German expressionist artist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, but again was not used very often during Gauguin's time. So after this experience in Paris in 1889, he decides to go to Tahiti. And this is when he leaves his wife, who's in Copenhagen, Mette, and decides that he's going to find a new, purer world in Tahiti. And so he starts making these very, very different prints. We go from this bright, beautiful yellow sunshine paper to these very dark, moody woodcuts. And in some cases, they're almost abstract. They're almost difficult to read. He printed them in a very uncareful way. He didn't want everything to be perfect. That was part of the sort of rawness that he felt in Tahiti. He wanted to get back to what he thought was the quote-unquote primitive way of life. Although he often, when he writes letters back to his friends, he was a little bit disappointed it wasn't quite as primitive as he had hoped. And he said the Western, this colonializing tendency had already affected the way of life there. So what we see here is a beautiful, beautiful print called Te Fururu. And we see he always uses the Tahitian language in his titling, and then PGO for Paul Gauguin. And this particular woodcut is called Here We Make Love from 1893-94. And this came from a series of prints called Noa Noa, which would translate roughly to fragrant scent, again in Tahitian. And one of the things I show you here in this detail from right here is this sort of ghostly form, which goes over the lovers. So is it a question of there's something terrible to happen to you? We don't really know. But there's a lot of this sort of ghostly imagery that we see in these works by Gauguin. And this is another wonderful print called Navi Fonua, which means delightful land. And if it looks very muddy and unfocused, that's because that's how he wanted to look. He didn't want his printing to be perfectly registered. So here what we have is this young woman here who's plucking from this red flower in this beautiful Tahitian landscape. And you can barely see here a lizard, and I have a detail here. And because Tahiti didn't have any snakes, Gauguin wanted to use the lizard as a kind of Adam and Eve image. She's in the Garden of Eden. She's plucking the forbidden fruit, which in this case is the forbidden flower. And the lizard here is whispering in your ear. So in a way, one of the things that Gauguin was showing is a kind of failed paradise. He went there, he wanted to find something that was no longer there, and he came home and he was very distraught. But he continued to create these images, and he showed them in actually a private Paris studio. He showed these particular woodcuts along with this other Tahitian imagery. Now, there are two artists, although Gauguin very much embraced printmaking, as did Manet. These two artists who we see on the screen, Cézanne on the left and Renoir on the right, didn't particularly like printmaking. They didn't really want to make prints. But there was a very ambitious dealer whose name is Ambroise Vollard, and he very much encouraged them to make prints to reproduce their paintings in other media or reproduce other drawings. So what we have here is this wonderful color lithograph by Cézanne, and Vollard very much wanted them to make color lithographs because color was selling and color was popular at the time. So here we see Cézanne's bathers on the left in this very Arcadian landscape, men bathing in nature, dressing, undressing, relaxing, swimming. And on the left we see a Renoir that is called the pinning the hat. And so here we see a young woman who's actually pinning flowers on someone's hat. And again, Renoir was not so interested in creating color lithographs either. So both Cézanne and Renoir worked with a very famous color printer whose name was Auguste Claude, C-L-O-T. And Cézanne and Renoir would do the drawings on the stone, which would then be printed, and then Claude, the printer, would add the color stones afterwards. So in a way, these works of art are as much by Cézanne as they are by Claude, but poor Claude never gets the credit for it. So we're gonna end our discussion today with Toulouse-Lautrec. And Susan and Colin created this wonderful cabinet of Toulouse-Lautrec prints at the top of the stairs in this fabulously red room. It's like a Parisian brothel. It's great fun. So now that I've said that, I have to take a sip of water. So here we see Toulouse-Lautrec. Many of you may know he was a very, very small in stature. He came from a very aristocratic family who intermarried far too many times. And because of that, he had many ailments. And one of those was his bones broke very easily. And his father was this very manly man who wanted him to be a writer. And he kept pushing him to be a writer and a hunter. And poor Toulouse-Lautrec just wanted to be an artist, which was not something that his parents approved of at all. So they kept pushing him to ride. And he broke his legs so many times riding and falling off horses from his very brittle bones that he basically stunted his growth. So he said, to heck with this aristocratic lifestyle, I'm going to Paris. So we have this very famous image on the right, the Englishman at the Moulin Rouge. And the Moulin Rouge was this very famous Parisian cafe, which was well known for the Can-Can, very famous cabaret in Paris, otherwise known to us in 2001 from Nicole Kidman's performance in that wonderful Baz Luhrmann film. So here we see the Englishman in this very silhouetted form talking to these two women, definitely women of ill repute, and we can only imagine what it is that he's asking them about. We can go no further there. But one interesting thing to think about the posters, now there are these incredibly expensive deluxe works of art that we see hanging on the walls of museums, beautifully matted, beautifully framed. But here's how they were really used. This is a photograph by Atget from 1898, and it's a Parisian street. And here we have you see a man here who's pasting up the posters. So this, and I show you here, Toulouse-Lautrec's very famous La Goulou, a woman dancing. I mean, it's this kind of poster with the lettering that would have been pasted on the streets of Paris. And that's why it's really hard to find them in very good condition, because they were used in that way. Some of the other lithographs that Toulouse-Lautrec made were bought more in series as fine art prints, but a lot of them were used for actual posters. So this is another wonderful portfolio that Toulouse-Lautrec made in 1897. And here we see the cover, and it's L. Very difficult word to translate into French. Directly, it's sort of the women, but what it really means is those women. So Toulouse-Lautrec spent a lot of time in brothels. A lot of his friends were can-can dancers, were prostitutes. He had a great love of absinthe, which eventually killed. He eventually died in part of alcoholism. But here we see he has this very affectionate relationship with these women. It's not the sort of voyeuristic looking. These are his friends, and these are his confidants. And so here we see a woman putting her hair up. This is the gentleman who is implied, but we don't see. Here's his hat. And she's taking off part of her clothes and throwing them on the chair. So we know what's about to happen. And this portfolio showed a variety of times of day, them sleeping, waking up in the morning, going to bed at night, performing their work, but in this very sensitive way. And he created this portfolio of prints for this man named Pelé. And Pelé printed only pornographic imagery. That was sort of his market. There was definitely a market for pornography at the time. So in a way, he must have felt this was rather tame when we see these images. This is another one called The Seated Clowness on the right, which is on the wonderful posters that you see outside. And this was a woman that Toulouse-Lautrec was very close with. And he showed her, she did this crazy kind of can, and she had a name for it. But here we see her relaxing. So she's a clowness, she's seated here, and then there's another man in a top hat, making this sort of suggestive gesture at the woman next to her, probably again in the cabaret. But these amazingly gorgeous colors that he used, he was just an absolute master of lithography. And one of the things he did, and I really encourage you to get up close to these works, is he would actually splatter the paint or splatter the ink when he was creating these lithographs. So it has this very vibrant, very evocative texture to it. And I thought we'd end here with an image of the jockey. This is another color lithograph by Toulouse-Lautrec, just full of movement, full of excitement. And so this particular lithograph, called The Jockey, dates to the very last year of the 19th century, 1899. And in this work, we really can see the bravura draftsmanship of Toulouse-Lautrec, combined with these beautiful, vibrant colors and the immediacy of modern life, which he very much experienced and enjoyed at the racetrack. And in many ways, I think this work epitomizes the Impressionist line, which is why we chose it for the cover of the catalog, because here line and color merge as they race, Toulouse-Lautrec and his comrades race headlong into the 20th century. Thank you. So I know some of you might want to rush down to the exhibition, but I purposely left plenty of time for questions, because that's always my favorite part of the lecture. If that's okay, Susan? Of course. Please. So any questions? Don't be shy. Yes?
How are you able to tell if those ladies are not overviewed? What are the characteristics of that?
Because we just know. No, that's a very good question. And a lot of it is costume. We know the images that he was creating, and he told people, and we know that these were images of ill repute. But if you're a woman at the Moulin Rouge and you have red hair and you're dressed with this sort of costume around your neck and with the heavy makeup that we see here and the way their hair and the way their headdress very much signals. It's sort of like if you were walking, if you saw someone, I guess it's a little bit harder today because people dress so provocatively all the time. But if you're walking someplace, I don't know, this has happened to me certainly in Berlin. You see prostitutes on the street and you see when you say, yep, you know it when you see it, I guess. But it's really the costume and the hair color. Red hair was very much a sign of a prostitute. Yes?
And how about the earlier image, the one at the very beginning of the presentation that you showed us, the women with the dark, the tall headdress kind of?
Oh, yes. These women are the Constantin Guise. Again, it's really costume, and because we know from what Constantin Guise wrote to Charles Baudelaire that these were women of ill repute. And again, their hair is a little bit too done up. Their head costume is a little bit over the top, so it's that over-the-topness that we can really identify with women of questionable repute. Yes?
What techniques do you use for conserving pastels and other very delicate drawings?
That's a very good question. There's one pastel that did not travel here, and I'll tell you why. This pastel by Millet and the other by Pissarro, what an artist would do, pastel is actually very powdery. It's a kind of colored powdery pigment which is fused together with a kind of oil and turned into a stick that you draw with. For those, I'm sure many of you know that, but for those of you who don't. And so artists that draw with this, if you shook it, half the pastel would end up down to the bottom of the frame. So what artists would do is they would fix a pastel. And the only thing I can connect it with is like, it's basically like spraying hairspray all over something to have it stay the way you want it. So sometimes artists use many different layers of pastel, fixative, pastel, fixative. Mary Cassatt, for example, rarely fixed her pastels, and that means that they can't travel. If you travel them, it can be very dangerous. It can mean that, the work of art is forever damaged. In terms of conserving them, there's nothing you can do. On the other hand, there are some works of art in this exhibition that we did conserve, and I'll see if I can find one. We have a fantastic conservation lab up at the Stonehill Center. Let's see if I can find one. No, I'm of course not going to find one. Actually, none of these were actually conserved. But what can happen, actually the violinist, which relates to a painting in the Frick, just over time, because of humidification and because of a moist environment, the piece of paper was really like this, very wavy. So what we did is we flattened it, and so now it looks flat. Before, if it was lit from the top, you'd see all the waves, but now it's lit from the top and it's perfectly flat. So there are certain kinds of works that can be conserved. There's a big stain on it. A conservator can immerse it in a certain kind of ionized water, deionized water, and conserve it. So some works on paper can definitely be conserved. Others, if they're damaged, there's nothing you can do about it. Yes?
Gauguin was designed sorry.
No, you were asked.
Okay, Gauguin's design were obviously pretty avant-garde. Was it hard for their works to find a market as prints? I'm amazed to imagine that they would have gone a bit beyond the mainstream taste at the time.
No, I think that's a very good question. And part of the issue with this, these prints that they created, they wanted to have this print portfolio and also connect it with an art journal. And because, as you said, they were so sort of avant-garde and ahead of their time, they didn't sell very well. And Degas couldn't raise enough money to launch this journal. Okay, now if we go to Gauguin, these did not sell very well. You see prints that he did later of these woodcuts on the back of these yellow paper prints, which could be because, that was the only thing at hand, but it could be because they sold so poorly. He's like, oh, I may as well print on the back of them. No one wants the front of them. So some of them sold well, but a lot of these works that we absolutely treasure now were not as well regarded during their lifetime. Although I would say Vollard did a very good job of marketing color prints. He ended up kind of going out of business, but some of these color lithographs did sell well. But isn't that always the way? Van Gogh died completely poor, and now look what his paintings go for. So, yes?
When you think of the painter, you think of the painter always holding his own paintbrush, other than a Renaissance studio, which is churning out works of art. Some of these are very technical in terms of the technique. Would the art with Vollard say, well, I want to work side by side with someone to do these? Were they all right by the artist's hand, or the artist work with an artisan to produce the more technical prints?
That's a great question, and I was going to talk about that, but I said, oh, that's way too geeky. That's too printy, so I'm so glad you asked. So with this print, for example, the Cézanne on the left, what Cézanne did is he drew on a piece of paper with a greasy crayon. That piece of paper was then transferred onto a lithographic stone by the printer. Take an impression off, it's black and white on paper. Then what Cézanne did is he did a watercolor. He did a watercolor drawing over that impression. He gave it to Claude and he said, you make the color blocks. So it's a very, and Renoir did very much the same with the same printer. So some artists love that technical stuff. Gauguin loved working with different kinds of woodblock, different kinds of printing. So did Toulouse-Lautrec, so did Manet, so did Degas. They loved trying everything but the kitchen sink. Cézanne and Renoir would much have preferred leaving it to a printer. It doesn't show, they're both gorgeous works of art, but I think it's just sort of that inclination. Some artists are interested in the very technical things and others aren't, so that's a good question. That's why I always love giving credit to the printer. They never get enough credit.
How was Lautrec perceived when he first exposed his pictures?
He was also seen as fairly scandalous. I mean, these images, you think images of prostitutes and images of these kinds of women of ill repute. The Elle portfolio did not sell well at all at the beginning, but then later it definitely picked up some steam. But he was definitely seen as scandalous, I'm sure, especially to his parents. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. I don't want to hold you all hostage. Yes?
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Actually, a similar question about Lautrec and technique. I just peeked my head in and I was really surprised by how nuanced his lithographs are. Yeah. And I wondered how involved he was in the lithographic process.
He was very involved. He really enjoyed it. Now, just to give you a sense of when you were saying, the woman who asked the question, how involved, every color you see on that print at the left is a different lithographic stone. So the black and white that you see is sort of the keystone, and then every other color is printed on top. So the artist not only has to think about how am I going to, all these different stones, how are they going to print on top of each other, but which one should I print first, in what color? So he was a master lithographer, and he loved that printmaking process very much. It does. It's amazing the effects that he was able to achieve with lithography. And that's why, this is probably one of the most sought after, expensive Toulouse-Lautrec prints out there, the Clowness. It's so fun to see it here, front and center, and on the billboards. So thank you all so much for coming. Enjoy the show.